And over the next 3 days, he ties the daughter to a tree and hits her with a whip, with a metal tip on the end of the whip. And she's bleeding, and people are watching this. And he's saying, don't worry, that's not really your daughter screaming. That's the Jinn. That's the spirit. And finally, he beats her to death. She dies. Sudan was under the control of the British at this time, was a British protectorate. And so this British magistrate is calling in all these witnesses, and he's never heard of a Jinn. He's trying to understand the circumstances of this murder. And he calls in these two girls who watched him beat this woman to death.
Start with the biggest question of all. Is the supernatural real, or are we just wired to believe it is?
I mean, this is a question that's bigger than just the humanity. I am not a materialist skeptic. I'm not closed-minded. And some of the case studies that I look at in stories of possession and exorcism, I really don't have a satisfying explanation for it. Either all of the witnesses are simply lying, or I have no idea what happened. Occasionally you're able to catch someone in a lie, or they are truly sincere, but they may have misinterpreted something that can be explained. But then there are a few cases left over where I really don't know what to make of it. And so some people look at those cases and they say, that's it. That's our smoking gun. These are spirits. These are demons. I don't make that conclusion, but I invite other people to look at the evidence. I wrote a book called The Penguin Book of Exorcism. And for that book, I tried to collect primary sources from around the world and from different cultures of exorcism.
We're talking about people from all over the world. No matter what culture, what religion, what ethnicity, people are reporting similar sightings.
Nearly every culture on Earth has some tradition of spirit possession, that people are sometimes not themselves and seem to be inhabited by other types of entities. So that's almost universal. It defies explanation. Having said all that, the other side of the coin is I don't have all the answers.
What are the craziest cases that you've come across or you've read about that left you wondering, wow, this might actually be something very real?
There was a case from South Africa in 1906 with a group of Catholic missionaries. And they had a young girl there who they said would levitate about 5 to 6 feet in the air every day. And they would try to pull her back down, and they couldn't. And they wrote back to their mission and said, we've got this possessed girl, and we're doing our best with the case. So with something like that, I'm forced to conclude either these Catholic nuns are lying outrageously and they're making the whole thing up, or I truly have no explanation for what's going on here. The other thing that was peculiar and was a small detail in this story is they said when she floats, her clothes don't hang off of her body like you would expect them to. The clothes also float, almost as if she's in like a zero gravity zone. And then I read a report from St. Jerome writing in Jerusalem in the 4th century, and he said there's these women and they're possessed and they float. And the odd thing is their clothes float around them too. Their clothes defy gravity, and it's a small detail.
It sounds like you're describing The Exorcist.
Right. Well, if you watch The Exorcist, the clothes hang off because that's special effects.
Right.
That's not real. But in these two reports, there's this sort of odd phenomenon where the clothing is floating as well. And it's such a small detail to find in reports that were on different continents and centuries across. It really made me scratch my head and wonder, is there a real phenomenon here that we just don't understand and don't know about?
These scary movies that we watch, do you think they have a basis somewhere? It's not all fiction. Do you ever watch them and think, as I'm studying this is really close to the cases I've read?
The Exorcist famously was based on a real exorcism that happened in 1949. And William Peter Blatty, who wrote the novel The Exorcist, worked closely with the Jesuit order of priests who administered that exorcism. They gave him a diary of what happened. So in a way, that film is very realistic, and certainly in the way that an alleged exorcism is investigated and that priests are skeptical and they want medical testing. That's all very, very realistic. William Peter Blatty demanded William Friedkin to direct that film because he said William Friedkin has this hyper-real style. And he says, I want to take something that a lot of people are never going to believe, and I want to show it as being completely plausible and completely realistic. In fact, was upset at the famous scene where Reagan's head turns 360 degrees because he said, well, that couldn't happen in real life. Even if a demon was doing that, it would snap the person's neck and they would die. But Friedkin was so proud of the special effects that he got for that scene that he left it in.
Which horror movie would you say is the closest to reality? You have The Conjuring, The Exorcist.
Another film that people might be familiar with is The Exorcism of Emily Rose, And that was based on a real case that happened in Germany in 1976. And that was a very tragic case in which the patient died. This woman was given something like 67 exorcisms and finally died. And in her autopsy, they diagnosed it as malnutrition, that she had stopped eating throughout this process. But that also has made a really interesting horror movie that a lot of people are fans of.
Have you ever personally experienced anything that made you feel very strange and left you scared and shaken up?
There's been things that I cannot explain. When my wife and I were moving, there was a cocktail shaker she had been using, and it's a silly story about a cocktail shaker, but she used it, and then we were then it disappeared. We didn't know what happened to it. It was totally gone. We had a pile of stuff in our garage that we were unpacking. It was about 10 feet tall. And somehow the cocktail shaker had gotten into the center of that 10-foot tall pile of boxes, which would have taken about 45 minutes of moving stuff around. So how did it get there? And it's a branded cocktail shaker. It's very specific. In the 1800s, they would have called this an apport, the idea that spirits can move objects around sometimes. And then this past Day of the Dead, my wife said a prayer for the dead, including her father who passed recently. We turned out the lights and went to bed. And then my iPhone came on by itself. Spotify came on by itself. I was laying in bed. Some people have had that experience before. I guess Spotify glitches. And it started playing a song by the band Queens called Silent Lucidity. It's not on my playlist or anything like that. And if you listen to the lyrics of the song, it starts saying, "You're in bed right now. I'm watching over you. You think people are dead, but they're not really dead." It was a very, very strange coincidence.
I would absolutely freak out if that happened to me. Did you freak out?
Well, I didn't freak out because I thought, well, if this is a message from the dead, it seems to be a benevolent one. It seems to be my father-in-law is checking in on us, and I had a good relationship with my father-in-law, but really an uncanny, weird experience. It took me a long time to fall asleep after that.
They always say, don't try to contact the spirits. Do you think because you study these things and you're always reading about them, do you think they follow you?
I don't know. I don't think that I have unusual experiences more than other people. Certainly my students have had much weirder experiences. College students, because they tend to stay up late and not have regular hours, they experience sleep paralysis very often, which can be a really frightening experience. You wake up and you can't move.
I've experienced it
Yeah,
quite a bit.
yeah.
And it's absolutely terrifying because it feels very real. It feels like you're awake and I can't talk, I can't move, but I'm awake and I'm aware. Do we know scientifically what causes sleep paralysis? Have you looked into that?
So you have motor neurons that switch off when you sleep. And if they don't, you'll sleepwalk. You'll act out your dream. So that's a natural part of sleep. And sometimes when people wake up, the motor neurons do not come back online. So they're conscious, but they can't move their body. And we understand it's not magic. It's a neurological phenomenon. But we don't understand why it happens. It's very rare. And we don't know why some people experience it sometimes, but usually only a few times in their lifetime. So it's still very mysterious. Some patterns we've discovered about who's more likely to experience it than others. And some people are still in a hypnagogic state. They're not fully awake. And they describe seeing people in the room. And this is where kind of how you approach the data gets really interesting, because if you're a materialist, if you're a skeptic, you say, well, it wasn't a demon in your room. It wasn't the supernatural. You just had sleep paralysis. But if you were a believer, you'd say, yeah, but what caused the sleep paralysis? Why did this happen that night? Why did it happen to me and not to somebody else? This was not known to medical science until about the 70s. And the way that we discovered it was there was a doctor named David Hufford, and he was doing ethnography in Newfoundland where people there said, well, there's something called the night hag, the old hag that attacks you at night. And people would speak to each other and say, yeah, I had a rough night last night. I got hagged. And people would say, oh, I hate it when that happens. And everyone thought they were just crazy. These are just superstitious rural people. And what Dr. Hufford realized is, no, they're not kidding. There's actually something medically going on here. But for a long time, nobody knew what this was. And an accompanying system is often a weight on the chest. There's a cluster of nerves in the solar plexus. And so people feel like there is some being or force straddling them. And so Newfoundland, they would say that's the hag. The hag comes and rides you at night. But I know someone in the Navy who experienced this, and he thought the base is under attack. There's someone on top of me throttling me. So some people describe seeing demons or shadow people. And this also comes up in literature about alien abduction a lot. People say, I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't move. I can see creatures with big black eyes walking through the walls or moving around the room. So it's a really scary and poorly understood phenomenon.
And these are reports you're talking about, not just from America. They're from all over the world.
Yeah, that's right. All over the world, we know that sleep paralysis happens to human beings in every culture. So they have different ways of talking about it. But one thing that makes it so scary is because it's so rare, often you have no context for understanding what's happening to you. You may have never heard that this is a thing. And what Dr. Huffer discovered is if you have supernatural folklore, that is at least a way of talking to your community and having a vocabulary for explaining these bizarre events that people experience.
In all religions, they all believe in the supernatural. Christianity is demons, in Islam it's the Jinn. Which religion has the most detailed explanation of the supernatural? And could the sleep paralysis be that, the Jinn?
In Christianity, you have angels and demons, and you have centuries of what's called demonology, of Christian theologians trying to figure out what exactly are demons and what are their powers and what are they allowed to do by God and what are they forbidden to do by God. And then in Islam, you have a tradition of these beings called the Jinn. And so in Islam, God made human beings out of dirt, and he made the angels out of light, and he made the Jinn out of smokeless fire. And so Jinn are in some ways like us. They can choose to be good or evil, but they don't have physical bodies the way that we do. And so they can shapeshift and they can create illusions and they can possess people.
So I actually know quite a bit about Jinn. There's a doppelganger of each of us in the Jinn world as well.
A lot of Muslim cultures have that belief that you could have a doppelganger or even like a sibling or a sister or something like that that lives in the Jinn world. In the Quran, there is a chapter called the Surah of the Jinn, which describes Jinn coming to listen to Muhammad and learn about Islam. And there's even a mosque in Saudi Arabia, the Mosque of the Jinn, where this supposedly happens. But there are lots of people throughout the Muslim world who are fearful of Jinn and fearful of Jinn with bad intents coming into their lives or possessing them.
Could all religions be describing this same phenomena? They're just giving it a different language?
Yeah, I think that is a common assumption across religions, right? So Christians are famous for looking at other religions and they talk about different types of spirits or ancestors or ghosts. And some Christians will say, but those are all really just demons. We're talking about the same thing, but you don't know what it is. It's tricked you. It's actually a demon. And lots of traditions do this. So they're looking for a shared vocabulary across traditions to talk about the same phenomenon. In Judaism, there are traditions of exorcism and binding spirits that go at least back to the 1st century CE. And today, there are rabbis who perform exorcisms. There's a being in Jewish folklore called a dybbuk. A dybbuk literally means like something that sticks to you, something that clings to you. And it's not clear if dybbuk are truly demons or if they are more like lost souls. They're souls that can't move on, and so they are trying to possess someone who is alive. And the idea in Judaism is not just any rabbi can do this. You need a rabbi who has kind of some mystical training, some kind of special kind of X factor. But if you get the right rabbi, they can get the spirit to move on and leave. And usually we'll command the spirit to tell its story, right? What exactly are you doing here? Why have you not moved on?
So they're communicating with the spirit.
That's right. And in the Christian tradition, you're really not supposed to get real chatty with demons during an exorcism. You ask its name very often because there's an idea that if you know an entity's name, you have some power over it. But then you tell it to leave. In the Jewish tradition, the rabbis are more likely to talk to the spirit, right? Who are you? Who were you when you were alive? If they're a demon, I even found one account where the rabbi asked these demons, well, where did you come from? And they said, well, in temple, this cantor sings really beautifully. And when people look at that cantor, they have lustful thoughts. And that gave birth to us. That's where we're from. And he tells the demons, okay, we can't be here in this house because you're bothering people. I want you to live in this abandoned well. Just live at the bottom of the well, and that's going to be a good place for you to live. Very different from commanding a demon to return to hell.
We live in this scientific age, but yet the supernatural hasn't disappeared yet. Why?
Well, this is sometimes called the secularization narrative in religious studies. So there was an idea that human beings begin being very primitive and believing in magic, and then magic gives way to monotheistic religions, and then finally that gives way to science, and we all become scientific rationalists. And now sociologists are saying, we were probably wrong about this. This doesn't really seem to be true for several reasons. One, you can have a lot of access to technology and scientific training and still be a religious person and still believe in the supernatural. But also, science continues to find new mysteries and new things that are very hard for us to explain and hard for us to understand. Scanning brains of people while they are experiencing glossolalia, speaking in tongues in Pentecostal churches. So speaking in tongues actually began in Texas in the very early 20th century with Pentecostal Christians who were reading the Bible. And in the Bible, there is a miracle where the apostles are able to speak and everyone can understand them. No matter what language they know, they can understand the gospels that are being preached. And this is considered to be a gift of the Holy Spirit. Some Christians assume, well, that happened in the age of miracles. The age of miracles is over. Things like that don't happen anymore. Pentecostals say, well, who said the age of miracles is over? This is God's language. This is a special language that the Holy Spirit is using to communicate with people. And if you're not a member of the church, it may sound, frankly, like nonsense. But what the brain scans have shown is this is not just someone sort of casually making up nonsense words, that there are actual neurological patterns going on in their brain. Parts of the brain light up when they are filled with the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues that don't otherwise. So something is really happening to them that we can study scientifically, even if they are not actually speaking a known human language.
Let's talk about the government, right? This is a really big topic right now. For decades, they've dismissed UFO sightings. And Congress is now holding hearings about what they call unidentified aerial phenomena. Why has this topic suddenly become legitimate?
It is interesting that the government sort of made fun of anyone who talked about UFOs until relatively recently when it was disclosed that actually they've spent a lot of money on this.
The Pentagon investigated UFO sightings through the programs like AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It was a secret program. They spent $22 million. They created this whole thing to investigate this phenomena. So why would the government be hiding this from us while they're investigating it? I mean, what can happen if it does exist and they let us know?
So the UFO phenomenon began in 1947. That was when someone first said, I saw these unidentified flying objects. It was a pilot named Kenneth Arnold. And by the end of the year, 800 people, there had been 800 additional sightings of people saying, I saw these disc-like objects in the sky. And by the 1950s, you had new religions emerging. You had people saying, I am communicating telepathically with the aliens. They are our space brothers, and they're here to save us, because this was the Cold War. This is people were afraid of nuclear weapons. They said these are ships from our space brothers. They understand, they know about God and Jesus just as we do, but they have different names for them. And so we got UFO religions very quickly. We had groups like the Aetherius Society and the Unarius Academy and Heaven's Gate, which a lot of people are familiar with due to the very tragic mass suicide of Heaven's Gate in 1997.
Would religion be better equipped to understand these things than science?
Initially, there was a so-called nuts and bolts hypothesis that these beings from another planet who have spaceships, machines that can travel faster than light, and that's where they're coming from. And pretty early on, there were people who said that seems very unlikely that that's what this actually is, including J. Allen Hynek, who was early on assigned by the government to investigate UFO sightings. And he said, I think these people are serious. I think there's really something here. But I don't think it's faster than light spaceships. If it's not from outer space, then it's probably from here, right? But it's some aspect of reality that we don't know about. And as early as the 1950s, there were people saying it's extra dimensional. They're from here, but we just don't understand what here is.
Like they're invisible to us, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Like which sounds a lot like Jinn.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what Islam describes, that Jinn lives here. We just can't see them, but they can see us and that they have superpowers.
They can shapeshift, they can possess people, they can create illusions. So shows like Stranger Things kind of exhibit this idea of it's not another planet, it's another dimension. It's another dimension that exists alongside all of us all the time. We just can't normally see it or interact with it. This idea is researched further by scientists. I think where religious studies can really help is we have the data. We have been studying the history of these unexplained events going back thousands of years, and a lot of my colleagues can read these accounts in the original languages that they were written in, which is very important because things get lost very quickly in translation. So we can provide the data. What we need is a new scientific paradigm that can actually interpret that data and help us kind of think better about what's actually really going on here.
Recently, President Obama was on a podcast and he was asked if aliens were real. And he responded very firmly and said, yes, they are real. And then not long after, President Trump came out and said that they were working on declassifying and releasing all these documents. If intelligent life was to be confirmed today, which religion would adapt the easiest and which would struggle the most?
That's really interesting. I think the Catholic Church has thought about this a lot. They have an official Vatican astronomer, and they've discussed, I guess we'll have to try to missionize the aliens and try to convert them to Catholicism. There are certain more conservative evangelicals who are very upset about the idea of extraterrestrial life because they've said the way that we interpret the Bible, there is no life on other planets. We are the only, sentient species that God created, and it would upset us to think that there would be other planets. And they also don't like the idea of extraterrestrials because they believe in creation and they're upset by the idea of evolution. And so they say the idea that intelligent life could have evolved on other planets goes against our religion. So I think they would have to probably rethink some things if we met visitors from other planets.
Based on your research, is there any evidence that we are sharing this world with somebody else that we can't see?
I mean, it's a fascinating question, and there are so many strange examples from religion, from accounts of spirit possession and exorcism, and also from ufology, right? Whitley Strieber, San Antonio resident for a long time, wrote this book, Communion. He has these really bizarre experiences of encountering he calls them the visitors. And people have interpreted this as aliens who are abducting him, being an alien abductee. But if you talk to Whitley Strieber, he says, I don't know what they are. I never said they were aliens from another planet. All I know is they're visiting us. They looked like the Greys. They had these large, enormous black eyes. And he said initially that this was terrifying. These things would abduct him, and that his mind sort of recoiled from it, from the fear so badly that he repressed it. So he saw a therapist about mental health issues, and he went under hypnotic regression, and he says that he recovered these memories.
When you say he was abducted, where did he go? Where did they take him?
He says that he was taken into what appeared to be some sort of craft, mechanical-looking room somewhere where there were apparatuses that were extracting samples from his body and things like this. And Rice University has now been collecting what are called the Whitley Strieber letters, because when he published Communion in 1987, thousands of people all over America wrote to him and said, this happened to me too. I saw the same things. The same things came into my room and did similar experiments. And so Rice University has collected all of those thousands of letters where they can be archived, and researchers can actually begin to go through them systematically and start to see if there's any significant patterns. Is this just sort of weird people writing a weird letter for no reason, or is there something we can actually study here? This was made into a kind of quirky film starring Christopher Walken as Whitley Strieber, but I think what that film is trying to show is that while this is initially terrifying, in the end, Whitley Strieber concluded that he achieved some kind of enlightenment, that these beings were ultimately not malevolent. They were trying to show him something, but the only way that they were able to do that was through these very kind of terrifying experiences. And this is also an idea that we find in religion, that the path to God often involves a moment of real fear and terror. And if you read the Old Testament, God is this really fearful, awesome being. When Moses goes up on the mountain to get the laws, nobody wants to go anywhere near that mountain. They don't want to meet God. God is scary. And so that's an interesting connection between what we know from studying world religion and experiences described by alien abductees.
Is there anything in your research that you've come across that you really made you think that this could be a possibility, that our ancient civilizations had those sort of capabilities and were more in contact with the supernatural than what we are today?
I do talk to professors of archaeology, and they do get frustrated because they'll say, the Egyptians really were very, very smart. They really could build these things. It's not only aliens that can build anything impressive. But I do think that we should take seriously, human beings have not changed that much in thousands of years. So I think ancient civilizations were really clever, but also they did have these extraordinary experiences and these connections to the supernatural, just as modern people do. So the so-called ancient alien hypothesis, it's really big in the culture right now. I think the show Ancient Aliens is in its 20th season or something like this. It's a really fascinating idea. But I also think we shouldn't be, I don't want to risk not giving credit where credit is due. I think ancient cultures like the Mayans and the Egyptians who built these amazing structures may have been able to do that all on their own because they really were brilliant civilizations.
But have they left any sort of evidence that maybe they did it? There was some sort of contact, even if they didn't help them build anything, but just some sort of communication?
We have records of people saying our laws were given to us by the gods, or Shama in Babylon, the code of Hammurabi. King Hammurabi didn't say he made up this code. He said Shamash, the god of the sun, gave it to him. And we just assume he's just making that up. That's just a good story. But what if somebody did give him those codes? Right? What if it's not made up? It is an assumption that gods are not real. And so these stories describing contact with the gods, therefore, are just simply totally made up. But some people will just start to ask, how do we know that? Right? And if it isn't just totally made up, if it isn't just a story, what were these people talking to? Who were they interacting with? Who were they making love with? If we're looking at Greek mythology, for example. And so again, people who are interested in ufology say maybe this is the same group of entities, right? That the type of beings going into Whitley Strieber's house in the middle of the night, maybe these are the same beings recorded in ancient mythologies around the world.
They're just labeled differently throughout the years.
And understood differently, yeah. Right? We can't understand something except through the framework of our own culture.
Why do some religious leaders believe that demonic activity is rising right now?
That's an interesting question. The exorcism is traditionally a ministry of healing. It's supposed to be a private interaction where a minister or a priest is supposed to help someone who is experiencing the negative effects of having a demon in their life. But increasingly, we are seeing exorcism being used in kind of political ways, right? To signal, I don't just have a disagreement about this political issue, but this is really evil, right? And people need to stay away from this. So I think partly it is significant that as we are having a culture war right now, as we are having really sharp divisions between the left and the right, this language of a rising tide of demonic evil, you hear these kind of talk today, it is, if among other things, it is one way of expressing that I'm really not okay with the way that some people are living their lives right now in the United States. So people who talk about a rising tide of evil are often very pro-life. They're often very skeptical of the transgender community, and these things will usually be associated with each other. Gabriel Amorth, a very famous exorcist in Rome, there was a film based on him called The Pope's Exorcist. Somebody asked him, why are there so many more exorcisms needed right now? And his answer to me was not very satisfying, but he said, I think it's because everyone has started doing yoga, and taking a yoga class opens you up to demons, and all the young people are reading Harry Potter. And I think Harry Potter opens you up to demons.
So what he's saying is our culture now is opening us up and inviting those demons.
That's right. Yeah, that's a very common claim, right? That certain kind of, whatever aspects of culture the religion is opposed to, it's not just bad for you, it's not just bad socialization or bad for your mental health, but these are literally ways that demons can come into people's lives. So Gabriel Amorth founded an organization called the International Association of Exorcists. And he said the Catholic Church has become embarrassed. He formed a group of priests who were interested in exorcism, And they lobbied the Catholic Church to basically start to take exorcism more seriously. And they've honestly been very successful. When the film The Exorcist came out, almost no Catholic priest knew anything about exorcism, and they wouldn't be talking about it in public. And now we have Catholic priests who are proud exorcists and going to conferences on exorcism and even have podcasts about their experiences as an exorcist. So that has totally changed, and Gabriel Amorth was a big part of that.
Are they keeping track of the number of exorcisms in every religion? How do we know that there's a massive rise in his opinion?
The church does not release official numbers of exorcisms, but Gabriel Amorth bragged by the end of his life that he had done 130,000 in his lifetime. He lived a very long life. I don't think all of those exorcisms were necessarily kind of full dramatic exorcisms like you see in the film, but that's a lot. So we don't have exact numbers, but it's very clear that exorcism went from being almost unheard of in the 1960s and prior to now being relatively common. The Diocese of Washington, D.C. even has an app you can download. And if you think you need an exorcism, you can put your information in the app and they'll get back to you. I mean, that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago.
We talked about every religion has its own form of exorcism. Can you talk about those? Like, what do they do in Christianity versus Judaism versus Islam versus Buddhism?
Yeah, so Christianity, exorcism is very, very important because God took the form of an exorcist, right? Jesus was God, and one of the ways that Christians know Jesus was the Messiah was he's casting out demons all throughout the Gospels. But other traditions have ideas of exorcism as well. So the Quran does not describe exorcism, but there are what's called the hadith, which are things Muhammad supposedly said. And we have at least one of the hadith in which Muhammad does perform an exorcism. And it's not very dramatic. He sort of blows breath on a boy and tells the spirit to leave. And that's effective. So today there are some Muslim exorcists who might recite prayers from the Quran and sort of command a spirit to leave. In northern Africa, there are these Muslim holy men called marabouts that are thought to have this special kind of charisma or mystical quality that lets them command spirits. And in places like Pakistan, there are tombs of dead Muslim mystics called Sufis, and people who are thought to be possessed might be brought to those tombs with the hope that kind of the leftover holiness of one of these holy men will drive the spirit out. So Islam's the second biggest religion in the world. It's very spread out. So there's lots of different traditions within Islam. So if you think you have a jinn, what the community decides you ought to do depends very much on what part of the world you happen to be living in.
I mean, when I was doing a little bit of research before our interview, I even came across some groups in North Texas, apparently, that specialize in Islamic exorcism. And I thought, wow, I mean, is it that common to where you have groups from different religions all over the country that perform and tell you, hey, come call me if you need help?
I'm actually not that surprised that we would have Muslims living in Texas who are experiencing jinn possession, and they want a Muslim to fix the problem, to exorcise the jinn.
Is there anybody keeping track of how many people report possessions, whether they're Christian, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, there's not really a good way to keep track of that. We have kind of anecdotal indicators. So if someone boasts, I've performed this many exorcisms, or if we see a church website advertises that they're willing to do deliverance ministry or exorcism, we have that data. But a lot of people who get an exorcism, they don't want anybody to ever know about it.
So there's a lot of conspiracy theories, especially these days after the Epstein files were released, and there's a lot of theories about cannibalism and rituals and torture and Satanism. How common is that? And are we underestimating the supernatural belief and its influence on politics?
Yeah, so Satanism is actually having a moment right now. There's a group called the Satanic Temple that formed in Boston in 2012. And they are known for these kinds of political provocations, like wanting to put up a statue of the devil next to the Ten Commandments at the Oklahoma State Capitol, or demanding that Satanists seeking an abortion can circumvent state laws restricting abortion.
But it's one thing to put a statue, and it's another to kill a child and sacrifice it as a ritual.
Right. Yeah. I've written a book on the Satanic Temple. They're not hurting children or promoting sacrifice or anything like that. Nor does the Church of Satan. They explicitly prohibit any kind of practice like this. So there's always been rumors throughout history that there's these sort of groups of people amongst us, this conspiracy. They look like everybody else. They act nice, but in secret, they're doing the most horrible things you could ever imagine. This is what the Romans said about Christians. They said to become a Christian, you have to murder a baby. And they sort of, the ritual of initiation in Christianity tricks someone into murdering a baby. And then they could say, now we've got you. If you ever stop being a Christian, we'll blackmail you. So it's really important to take stories like this with a grain of salt, right?
And these groups are said to be worshiping Baal, and they're doing this because of Baal.
Yeah, so Baal is a character in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. And it's the god of a rival civilization. So you have the Israelites and their neighbors worship pagan gods. And in 1 Kings, the prophet Elijah has basically a contest with the prophets of Baal, and they have to see whose god will light a sacrifice. And the prophets of Baal can't do this. They build their sacrifice and they pray, and they even cut their faces to try to appease Baal, and nothing happens. There's no magical fire. Elijah even douses his sacrifice in water to make it wet and calls on his God, and it bursts into flames. So he wins, right? And so for the Israelites, they said, well, Baal might be real, Baal might be a god, but what matters is our God is more powerful. Well, later, Christianity said, well, Baal wasn't a god exactly. Baal was a demon. Baal was a demon who had tricked these other civilizations into worshiping him as a god and into offering sacrifices. Early Christians said that demons like offerings of blood and smoke, and that's why they sort of tricked ancient people into worshiping them. And then by the Middle Ages, you start to get these demonological treatises with lists of demons, and so now Baal is listed as a king of hell. And there are exorcisms where people have asked the demon, what is your name? And it will say Baal. So the question is, if people thousands of years ago would make sacrifices to Baal, is anyone today still doing it? Possibly, but I haven't personally encountered anything that would convince me of a secret conspiracy of Baal worshippers. If I find one, I'll let you know.
Do you believe, though, that there are secret groups right now that are Satanists and performing rituals?
Well, I think there's absolutely secret groups that are doing terrible things. That's what we're learning from the Epstein files, right? To me, what's being described in the Epstein files is so terrible, I don't care whether the perpetrators are Satanists or Christians or Buddhists or whatever. The crimes speak for themselves. In my experience, you have groups of Satanists who are organized, like the Satanic Temple and the Church of Satan, and you have Satanists who are criminals. So I would put Richard Ramirez in that category, a serial killer who said, I did my crimes for Satan. What I don't see a lot of evidence of is organized criminal Satanists, right? Now, there's a group online that's been getting a lot of headlines lately called the 764 Network that claim to be Satanists, and they're involved in really horrible things, child pornography and things like this, right? As best I can tell, this is mostly very troubled young men, often as young as about 13 or 14, who have often experienced abuse themselves. So it's a real social problem. It needs to be dealt with rapidly, but I don't think that's the kind of thing people have in mind when they talk about these big satanic conspiracies.
It's interesting because you're in the middle. You're looking at it from religion and science. So at the end of all of this, tell me what's real and what's not.
I study people. Right? I study people's beliefs and their experiences, including extraordinary experiences, including experiences of getting abducted by aliens or undergoing exorcism, as far as studying things that are not people, studying spirits and gods and aliens. I tell my students, I want you to form your own conclusions. I want you to look at the data and think very hard. I want to practice a critical thinking, but at the end, you have to decide what's actually happening to these people when these strange experiences are occurring to them.
How many years have you been teaching those classes? You teach religion and an exorcism class.
Yeah, I've been teaching that class since 2014.
Most of your students, what do they think? Do they walk out believing that the supernatural is real, or are they skeptics?
So I have all kinds of students from Central Texas. I have students who are atheists and coming in assuming all of this is just ancient people were too stupid to know about mental illness. And then I have students coming in who are very religious and they're from evangelical churches in Texas, and they assume everything is a demon, just as described by my pastor. And really all that I am trying to do is create a moment where they sort of withhold judgment for a little bit and kind of see how complex some of these cases really are and how hard it is to actually know with certainty what's really going on, and just kind of create some space to be thoughtful and critical.
I want to hear your craziest, most scary encounter or story.
One of the cases that I found was from a murder trial in Sudan in the 20s. It involved Jinn, and a young woman was possessed by a Jinn, that's what her parents had decided. They took her to a local exorcist. And in Sudan, there's a type of Jinn called a czar, and often you can play music for it and get it to leave. And she says, this is beyond my power. This is a really powerful, dangerous Jinn. I can't fix it. So they get another guy who is a sort of wandering exorcist, and he says, I can get this spirit out of your daughter, but I might need to use kind of extreme methods. And so this Sudan was under the control of the British at this time, was a British protectorate. And so this British magistrate is calling in all these witnesses, and he's never heard of a Jinn. He's trying to understand the circumstances of this murder. And he calls in these two girls who watched him beat this woman to death. And he says, how could you do that? How could you just sit there and watch a man beat a tied up girl to death with the whip? And they said, well, because he's the exorcist. He knows what he's doing. We didn't want to interfere. We didn't want to make it worse. And so to me, this was the scariest story in the whole book, right? Because as scary as a lot of the things are involving demons, it's very rare to it actually seems like a demon literally kills somebody, right? But here you have kind of a culture where you have kind of this perfect storm of events, and someone is not only murdered, but murdered very slowly and in public, right? And no one does anything. So to me, the idea of something like that happening again is very disturbing.
It is very scary.
And I don't think that that's something that can only happen in a place like Sudan in the 1920s. I think there's lots of cases of people who are killed or hurt during exorcisms, especially children. So maybe if there's one thing I needed to say, perhaps it's that not all exorcisms are safe. And it's if you're thinking about trying to get an exorcism, you should be aware that things like restraining people, trying to beat demons out of people, trying to force holy water down people's throats, all of this is very dangerous. A safe exorcism is one where someone is simply talking to the spirit or talking to the demon. But when things get physical, safety is not guaranteed, and a lot of people have been hurt or died during an exorcism.